to look at textual criticism, other criticisms, many other things, I began to realize that there was just a lot of problems with the Bible, and I really was having trouble reconciling them. Unfortunately for me, I probably would have become an unbeliever fairly soon after that, except my father died. And this caused me to suspend my questions on an emotional level and just believe because I wanted to see him again. I graduated Asbury in 1996, and at first I struggled to get in the ministry until a friend of mine helped me out when he took over the church that I attended in Reed City, and then he brought me in as one of the leaders, and I started out as a Christian education director and pastor from 1997 to 2001, licensed in the Assemblies of God as an Assemblies of God minister in 1999. I became an ordained minister in 2001. I also started to pastor my first Assembly of God church at that time. I started my second church in 2004, and I left the Assembly of God in 2006. My problem with the Assemblies of God and Pentecostals in general at that point is, as a minister, I was directed a lot to gin up the emotions and get things going, sort of prime the pump for the Holy Spirit, so to speak. And so I ended up doing a lot of things that I guess I would consider unethical after a while. And eventually I just got tired of it. I'm more of a thinking pastor, and I have this honesty streak that sometimes just doesn't go away. And so after 2 bad church experiences, I left the Assemblies of God for good. I had a year of doubt and depression. Actually read through the whole Bible from cover to cover again, believe it or not. But I didn't know how to do anything else, so I became an independent and eventually a Congregationalist. I was a Congregational church minister from 2008 to 2018. I accepted the position of pastor of Hersey Congregational Church in Hersey, Michigan in September of 2008, a post I held until May of 2018, so almost 10 years. I liked the more laid-back atmosphere of Congregationalism. It had more relaxed doctrine. It was very open. I was allowed more freedom to preach what I felt I wanted to preach. We also did some good community work. We had a soup kitchen that fed people once a week. We had a food pantry where we'd help people out. It's a very economically challenged area, so we were doing a lot in that regards. And so I was helping a lot out there, and I was involved in the community, served on the school board, did several other things that I did at that time. And it was just a lot of good things. The problem is I began to teach my Life of Christ class again, and a lot of my old questions from a theological biblical point began to resurface. I began to read people like Hitchens, Barker, Dawkins, and others. People would ask me what I was doing, and I would say, I'm doing research because I don't find apologists to be very good, so I think I can be a better apologist than them. What I discovered is something very disturbing about people that are apologists, people that are trying to defend the faith against criticism, is that they very rarely dealt with the actual questions of free thinkers, critics, agnostics, or atheists. I really found them very disappointing as a believer. In the end, it was a quote from Dan Barker that sealed the death of my faith. And I've had a couple of people ask me what that is, and I haven't said it yet, but now I'm going to tell you. This is this quote: "The very concept of sin comes from the Bible. Christianity offers to solve a problem of its own making. Would you be thankful to a person who cut you with a knife in order to sell you a bandage?" Dan Barker. My deconversion story goes something like this. I was preaching a series of messages on the time when I heard this quote called Sin and Salvation, and this quote was rattling in my head. I got into the pulpit, prayed to God that he would provide me with some sort of answer to my dilemma to answer this question. How can I prove that sin isn't made up? How can I prove that it's something that is genuinely real? I finished my sermon on sin and sat down, and while waiting for the offering and the final announcements to be said, I sat there realizing that Dan Barker was right. Sin was a completely man-made concept. And here's where the real low point comes. Then it hit me personally. I said to myself, son of a bitch, Ed, you make your living preaching a lie. You make people feel guilty they're sinners, offer them an imaginary solution, and in gratitude, they throw money in a basket to support you. You're a con artist. It was a very low point personally, and I will not forget it. Now, you need to understand the timeline here. This is about 2014 or so. I didn't leave the ministry till 2018. I stayed in it 4 years because I didn't know how to do anything else. My own version of caught in the pulpit. I was made even lower because this was my living. I had absolutely no other options at the time. When you've educated yourself completely in religion and theology, there's not a lot of other things that you can do with that. I tried to get more professional jobs with my 2 degrees that I had in Bible and theology, and they never amounted to much because the secular world just doesn't really respect that sort of thing. And I started reading Caught in the Pulpit by Dennett and Lascota, and I realized that was me. I heard about the Clergy Project at that time, but I had not given up all my thoughts on the possibilities of the supernatural, so I was not qualified to join them at the time. I did, however, began to start their exit strategy based on their recommendations. I started working on a degree in political science at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan, and I received that in fall of 2018, which if you watch the timeline coming up, this puts me at a little bit after I left my church while continuing to pastor the church. It was a very stressful thing to me to lie about my faith to maintain my job while at the same time trying to pursue something else. You want to talk about believing one thing and actually believing something else or not believing. This is a very stressful thing for ministers in particular, because the one thing you can't be is caught. Nobody can know that. I dealt with some of it by changing my preaching to a more practical relationship advice, love your neighbors yourself kind of thing. I opened up people to alternate viewpoints. I even preached once on how if somebody of a homosexual or lesbian or all that came into the church, that we should accept them and love them, which was a very interesting thing to preach at a church that had basically thrown off the United Church of Christ because of that very issue. But I kind of brought it up as something that we should do as loving Christians. And I felt worse and worse emotionally because I was having a lot of distancing between what I was believing, what I really believed, which was mostly nothing, and what I had to maintain in order to be a good pastor. Escaping the cage, it didn't go well. Emotionally, I was a wreck, but I held it in. My marriage grew cold. My relationships with my friends and family suffered. I didn't really feel I had anyone to talk to, as all the people around me were believers. And as a pastor, that is incredibly true. I read a study once that said that pastors have connections with unbelievers like once a week, whereas regular people have more than like 6 or 7 that are in the church. And so you don't have a lot of non-believers that are your friends or people that you deal with. Then the organist in my church died, and I had to preach a funeral where I said that pretty much nothing true in that sermon, except that he was extremely talented as an organist, which was true. And I made it really about him instead of about God and the afterlife, because I had a real fear at that moment that my unbelief was going to come out. And it was a real depressing moment. What happened was predictable. A woman in the church, younger and a newcomer, could see I was hurting and nobody else was talking to me. So she reached out to me, and one thing led to another, and an emotional affair resulted. I confessed it to my wife after a week of it, and we separated, and I resigned the church. Ironically, the last sermon I preached on was adultery. The hard landing. I entrusted my resignation to my worship leader and a friend of 9 years in the church, and that was a mistake. He tricked me in not stating that the affair was a reason, and then told the story himself. He got the church believing all sorts of things, and they voted both to fire me, and the council denied me severance afterwards. It needs to be understood that for almost 10 years, I never made more than $350 a week. no other benefits. I made more money working at Walmart where I work now as a part-timer after I was fired than I ever made at the church. I actually have bigger paychecks now. And that's just simply true. There's not a lot of finance. Most of us are not Joel Osteens. Most of us are not at that level. The vast majority of pastors are pastoring churches of 20 to 30 people, and they just don't have enough people to pay them well. In the end, only a handful of my former parishioners have reached out to me to this day, and it's been 2 years. Most see me and pass me without even saying a word. The affair ended and my wife and I reconciled, just avoiding divorce. That said, she is still a believer and I am not, which creates many issues in our relationship at times. So because of a lot of this stuff I was dealing with, I joined the Clergy Project, and this is where my Clergy Project story really starts. I joined the Clergy Project on October 22nd, 2019, realizing at that moment that I was truly an atheist. I had 3 problems: connections, identity, and deconversion issues. Part of being the forums there gave me a sense of not being alone, so I had new connections. And new connections are very important when you leave a church, and that's whether you're a pastor or not, because one of the things that happens is loneliness, because that community is suddenly pulled right out from under you. Through TAG, the Transitional Assistance Grants, I received counseling on career skills and direction. Mostly I needed to answer one question: what do I do that I now will never be a pastor again? Some people joke with me on that. Well, that's kind of like, what are you going to do now that you've grown up and reached the age of reason? Through the Secular Therapy Project, I was connected to a therapist, a relationship that remains to this day. It is through this that I've talked through a lot of my personal and deconversion issues. In January of 2020, I started my YouTube channel, The Rabid Atheist, where I talk atheism, deconversion, Bible, and theology issues. And part of that is working through my own deconversion issues that I'm still doing. So why am I an advocate for the Clergy Project? Why am I here talking to you? One is my own personal story. I don't think I would be where I am right now emotionally as far as confidence and as hope for the future without them. They provide something that a lot of clergy that don't believe anymore just do not possess. And it's just the support you need when you're making that transition. I also know that there are more ministers that out there that could use their help. I think the 1,000 members is only the tip of the iceberg. I am fairly certain that there's probably more. The only reason you can't get good data on it is because nobody's going to honestly answer that question, do you still believe? Because they think they're going to get ratted out. I feel the ministry is a unique career that has problems that require a unique exit strategy. And most ministers who lose their faith don't know what to do. I know I didn't. If I hadn't read Caught in the Pulpit, I wouldn't have had a clue what to do next. There is a need for a private and confidential place to discuss these things for those ministers so they get the emotional and professional support they need before they leave. I am a classic case of I really should have joined the Clergy Project about 3 years before I did. And if I had done that, a lot of my problems and a lot of the issues and a lot of the stumbling around that I did would have been a lot better. Now that I see from the inside what they do, it's definitely much more, it makes the transition not necessarily easier, but it allows you to take the right steps so you don't take as many missteps. In some cases, the consequences for some minister are very grave, and so support of all kinds is valued. Like I said, a lot of these guys are pseudonyms. I don't know them by their real name. I know them by a pseudonym that they use on the Clergy Project, because then I can't accidentally say something that might trigger somebody in their congregation that they might know them. With how connected we are, that can actually very easily happen. Deconversion as an emotional and mental issue is hard for any believer. If some of you have been through it, you know what I'm talking about. For ministers, this is a whole new level. It's your profession. It's your life. It's the central core of your existence. And all of a sudden, it doesn't exist anymore. And now you have to figure out a way to go forward. And that is very, very difficult. For me in particular, changing gears in my late 40s and to early 50s has been a real interesting transition. And the Clergy Project helps with that. It helps with a lot of that stuff, so you don't end up falling into a pit when you're trying to get out. I had a pretty hard landing. I know some guys that are in the Clergy Project that have exited, and they went through it before they got it. They exited it, and they had a far easier transition and avoided a lot of the emotional pitfalls. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to take any questions right now because I think that's more important.
I was going to say, do we just unmute ourselves? Is that how that works?
Yes, please do that.
And then just go back into mute. Okay.
Yeah, you
Most
just have to
cases, you
unmute
can hit
yourself.
the space bar and it'll temporarily unmute you, and then you'll go back in.
Okay.
Yep.
My,
Just use the space bar.
Before everybody got on the screen, I learned from Mr. Raby that the project has extended beyond our country into even other religions, and there's some people that are in situations that would even be life-threatening if they were exposed. That really surprised me that it's extended beyond the United States, so or Europe, but I assume it has. Is that how you understand it? It's
Yes, it's I have one of my friends on the Clergy Project that is a Muslim minister in Africa, and I'm of course not going to mention even his pseudonym or anything here because it could get back in that way. But yeah, he has a problem because his entire family is Islamic, and if they found out that he as a clergy member is no longer a believer, he could have some real dangerous situations affect him. And so he keeps that on the down low. What we provide for him is a place where he can vent. He can come to the forum and talk about what he's going through, and we can at least offer him the best advice we can. But yeah, part of the problem with even the name, the Clergy Project, we have been trying to come up with better names for overseas because that's a very Western thing. It's not necessarily an Eastern or a Middle Eastern thing. So we've been trying to see if we can either change the name or even come up with a better name for overseas ones that join and advocate for it, because they are in a very dangerous situation and they need something, that they can connect with. We recently had even an issue with American ministers because our Facebook page with its notification had the Clergy Project on it. And, if people are looking at their phone and they get a message from the Clergy Project, somebody's going to ask them about what that's about. So we had to change it to TCP group just to give it a little bit more anonymity, because even here in the United States, leaving your faith can lead to shunning and things like that. Some of these ministers are in that situation. I had a fairly mild theological situation where people weren't going to necessarily shun me, although practically they did. But it did, did become an issue in some cases for us. Let's see, I'm seeing on the chat one. Support for spouses and their families of recovering clergy. This is something that I am actually trying to talk about with people in the Clergy Project. Mostly it's for ministers, but there have been some situations where not only does the pastor no longer believe, but his spouse no longer believes, that neither one of them. And so what is the support for them? But more commonly is the minister leaves, and then the wife is kind of left, well, okay, what do I do now? I remember seeing a video of one of them where she said the Clergy Project kind of, because her husband was being supported, she felt supported because nobody else was talking to her either. It was weird. It's like your husband's become a pariah, so you're a pariah too. And that happens. And so, yeah, it's an issue, and it's something that I've been talking about with some of them. What happens if you have a spouse in this situation? It's something that needs to be developed. This is why you got to understand the Clergy Project is less than 10 years old. It's going to celebrate, its 10-year anniversary next March. this coming March coming up. And I'm not sure if that issue has been addressed as significantly as possible. We are a very young organization, and the surprising thing is, to a lot of us, is how fast it's grown in 10 years. I mean, it's about 100 people a year. There's just this stigma attached with people that leave the faith, particularly ministers, that suddenly nobody wants to support them or be there for them. And spouses, I imagine, go through a lot. So I know my wife went through a lot. She had to deal with multiple things on top of each other. And, so emotionally, she needed a lot more support than she probably got. I wasn't in a position to give her that support, and certainly she didn't have people around her that were doing very well either. So.
Ed, I was wondering, as you mentioned the financial situation of clergy, some churches have gotten PPP bailouts during COVID. Are clergy eligible for unemployment compensation?
It depends on I've applied for unemployment before as a clergy member and was denied because I was a clergy member. I don't know if the rules have changed since then. But ministers occupy that weird zone. They can be employees of the church, or they can be self-employed, and so they would fall under those statuses. In my case, I was always employed by the church, so I always had that option, except the one time I did it, they told me I was ineligible. And I am assuming it was because of my occupation. So I'm not sure if that really works for them. I do know that, thanks to the fact that, somebody pointed out that they don't pay unemployment, so they're not exactly that's probably true, because churches don't pay unemployment insurance. They are not eligible. So, so that's one of those things that happens. So it's an interesting quandary that a minister comes into. A lot of people look at the Joel Steens and all those guys and think that that's where most majority of clergy people are at. That is not true. The vast majority are where I was. I had a congregation of 20 to 30 people. I had a salary most of the time that was $300 a week and no other benefits. That is pretty standard and normal for most clergy members, probably 90% of them. And so if you leave the faith, now you're even in a worse situation. I never have had the opportunity to save up money for retirement or anything. My retirement is almost zero. If I didn't start working at Wally World again, I would not have anything. And over the last couple of years, I've built up some there, but it's certainly not near enough of what I'm going to need later in life. And the ministry kind of does that to them, which is why the occupational grant is so important to a lot of people. They need to know what they need to do to fix their financial situation. It is a big issue, and that's one of the first issues the Clergy Project addressed for that very reason.
How common is it for clergy to work two jobs in mainstream religions?
In mainstream, it not often. Like the Methodists, they'll just have you pastor 2 or 3 churches instead, or Lutherans usually have fairly large churches. I've noticed practically they seem to shrink down the number of churches, both the Catholics and the Lutherans, depending on the size of their congregations and how they need to support their ministers. Of course, Catholic priests, they have support all the way until they're dead from the church directly. So, and they don't, with their vows of poverty, they don't necessarily have to have a lot, although some people do question the vows of poverty from time to time, because you do get to live pretty well. You just don't have a lot of personal things. Outside the main line, like in the Assemblies of God, where I'm from, where you have more of a, across the tracks kind of church, more of a poor church, I would say it's incredibly common to have a second job. I know that even at my congregational church, I had a second job for about 5 years. But then my kids all graduated from high school. I didn't need the extra money as much, and my wife made good money. So we kind of settled back to me just pastoring the church and her doing that. So, I was, of course, following the call of God, so to speak, more than And a lot of people get into that trap. Like a pastor will be told that he needs to spend more time with his church and less time worried about, feeding himself. If he just has faith, he'll do better. Okay. And so he gets out there and he goes and decides to go full-time ministry, and his church stays the same. And, and then he finds himself even more broke than he was before. I've seen pastors leave really good secular jobs to concentrate on the church 100% and end up really regretting it because they end up spending all their savings and all their reserves. And then if they end up deconverting and leaving the faith, now they have a really bad situation financially. It is probably the key issue for most of us, including myself. That's why I went back to school. That's why I keep looking at different career paths and things like that. So I've got to figure out what I need to do in the next 10, 15 years in order to settle down where I don't have to worry about as much.
I would think that an obvious career path for a pastor is to go into counseling, because that's a component of the job to begin with. Is that?
Some of them do. For me, counseling was like my least favorite thing to do. So you got to love what you want to do, and that's just not something that I would enjoy. Mostly because my counseling back then, when you have a fundamentalist background in counseling, they don't really emphasize it that much. So a lot of clergy do counseling along these lines. The Bible says X, so do that. Okay. And that's the extent of the counseling. And I did a lot of that when I was in the Assemblies of God, and it didn't really change that much in congregational circles. And I had to learn a lot of my counseling techniques that were more psychological on my own. You can say one thing about clergy people: they read a lot. We are voracious readers for the most part. We just don't read the right books half the time. Okay, we read stuff that reinforces our faith. But we also read stuff like counseling books and things like that because we never got trained to do that. I'm not a licensed counselor, okay, and not even close, not a therapist. But people come to pastors because we're cheap, okay? They can get their counseling and they don't have to pay a lot of money for it, often nothing. I've lost track of the counseling sessions that I did that were pro bono. I did them for nothing. And after a while, I just stopped doing them, because, they take up a lot of your time and they don't give you anything. And other than a lot of more emotional things to worry about, because being in the church, it's a 24/7 emotional thing. You're always on call. It's always about the church. It's one of the things that me and my wife occasionally have fights about still. Is she'll start talking about church stuff, and I'm like, I don't want to talk about church stuff. I talked about church stuff for 20 years. I don't want to talk about church stuff anymore, because she still goes to church. And so I don't want to talk about it. So it's like, because it's all your life. It's every day you're worried and thinking about the church, because if this member gets upset and leaves, now you're down and you lose more of your financial support, and you got to placate everybody, yet at the same time you're maintaining this impossible standard that nobody can live up to. It becomes a vicious circle. It's really bad.
And what does the project recommend for clergymen still in the pulpit beyond what you did?
The exit strategy is to kind of, if I had gotten involved in the Clergy Project while I was in the pulpit, I could have gone through the career counseling ahead of time. As it was, I did it afterwards, okay? So then you can come up with a better plan of how you're going to exit this. Do I need to go to school? Do I need training? Do I need build my resume in some direction? The other thing you can do is a lot of deconversion counseling. I had to do all that myself.
No, I meant what do they recommend about how you conduct yourself in the church?
In the church?
If you're going to stay in, yeah.
Most of our discussion, because the real problem with that question is you're ultimately having to advise people that they have to lie. And for some of us, that is a real hard thing. Because you have to tell them, you got to keep your cover, because in some situations it could be bad. In other ones, we tell them, focus on the efforts of the church that you still agree with, like charitable work, political activism, things that they can focus on. Nobody's going to get upset with them doing it.
Hey, Ed, since you're probably obviously out, I would assume. So do you live around where we live, or?
And at the same time, it doesn't draw attention to avoiding theological and biblical studies. People, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, just changing the way you do your ministry in such a way that you don't draw attention to the fact that you don't believe. That's what they do. I had to do that on my own. People that join the Clergy Project have a whole forum of people that have been through it, and they can tell you what steps to take, what to say, what not to say, things like that. Changes. Most of what they get out of that is the individualized support of the community. Like if a minister comes in and says, I'm facing this situation where if I say this, they're going to know. Okay. And I have to say, okay, well, you're going to have to say that, but not mean it. Okay. And you know what? The problem with a lot of us in the Clergy Project is we're painfully honest. And it's the lies that have gotten to us, and we're tired of them. And yet to keep some in the pulpit, you have to tell a few. And it just gets hard. Trying to get to that, I think the biggest deconversion struggle is getting to the point of honesty again. The one thing I am happy about right now is I don't have to lie about anything. All right, I can tell people I don't believe, and here's why. When I was in the pulpit, I couldn't do that. I had to preach messages of this is Christianity and this is what we believe, and I believe it too. No, I didn't. But I had to do that. And most of our advice is how not to blow your cover, because for some of these it could be deadly. For others of it, the community cultural implications are very high. Family implications are high. We've literally had people when they came out, their family disown them. And trying to keep people's cover during all that is very, very difficult, because they're trying to make a transition. Because if they come out immediately that they don't believe, they're going to be in a very bad place. And then they're not going to have any support whatsoever, even from their church family. And a lot of them have friends and family in it. How do you deal with those people when you don't believe? How do you handle a counseling situation where a battered woman comes to you, for instance? My old advice as an Assembly of God minister was, well, the Bible says X, you're supposed to submit to your husband. And the Bible says, as long as he's willing to live with you as an unbeliever, you're supposed to stay with him, because that's what Paul says. Now I would probably give the advice, you got to find a way for her to get the message that she needs to leave that situation and that it's okay without blowing your cover. Okay. And that's the kind of stuff we deal with. Real life where people are getting hurt. Okay. And it's that community of advisors that have been through it that is invaluable. If I had that, there was a lot of things that wouldn't have happened. I don't think my affair would have happened, for instance, because I would have had emotional support from a group. Okay. I don't think a lot of other things would have happened either. And I would have, walked out of it in a lot better position. But that's pretty much the difference, is having the community of people that have been through it so you don't step on landmines. Okay. And it's really in ministry, it's a very situational thing. It really depends on the situation, because people walk into situations and they're like, okay, what do I do now? And it's helpful to go on the online community and say, what do I do now? And 6 people give you advice, okay, who have been there. Okay, I've done this, don't do this because that was bad, and do this because that worked out okay. That's the big difference. This is why this has been, from the beginning, an online community of support, because you're dealing with relationships here, and relationships are messy. There is no hard line. From a financial standpoint, we tell people to get their house in order, because if the hammer comes down and you lose your support, and churches don't play unemployment as somebody pulled out, you're without a job and you're without an income. Okay. And that's why often one of the big pieces of advice before they leave is save up some money. Get another job, save up some money, have a safety net, because I didn't have a real chance to do that because I thought I still had time. Okay. And, if I'd been in the Clergy Project, I probably would have done that a lot sooner. And so my story is a bad story. Yeah. In some ways. Yeah.
I have two questions. If I could, how do you know when it's time? Is it okay if I speak?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions. One of them is, you're obviously outed. Do you live around here where we live, or are you somewhere else in the country? I don't know.
I still live in my hometown where I preached and ministered.
Oh, okay.
So
So
I
so
grew
you're
up here. I graduated high school here. I pastored a church here for 10 years. So it's not just former parishioners that see me. It's people who knew me when, and they know the
okay.
story, and it can be very lonely. Yeah. So
My other question is this, and it's a problem. I'm not a minister. Most people would be very grateful for that, and but I have a problem that maybe you guys experience, is that when I'm with somebody who has this tremendous amount of faith, being cared for and taken care of, and having a place to go when they're dead, and all the whole package, you can sense how dependent they are on him, and so I let them have it. I mean I let them keep. I don't want to disturb them that much. It's not. I don't feel like that's my. I don't give myself permission. It seems like it's kind of cruel and hurtful if you challenge somebody that you get a sense they're very dependent on it, and so I just wondered if that was part of a problem that you have too, that they have also.
yeah, I can tell you a story of me and my relationship with my mother. My mother is still a very devout believer. Um, she still plays piano in the church, and she still does what she can. Her faith is a lot of who she is, and if I were to take that away from her, that would devastate her in a lot of ways. And so I have to ask the question, is it really worth that fight at times? She's lived her whole life that way. Okay. And so that's kind of one of those things that I have to talk to my therapist about on a regular basis, are these hills that I'm willing to die on? It's a little bit different with my younger family members in that case, because they don't know. So it's just, in my humble opinion, sometimes when I deal with people, I have to really assess whether it's worth it or not. Okay, you really have to, if you know the person really well, and you want to keep that relationship going, taking it slower is probably a better option. I started my YouTube channel with this very idea of helping people through this issue, because it can get pretty deadly sometimes at times with people. They get in your face. I've had people scream at me. A couple weeks ago, I had one of my former parishioners talk to me about how I needed to get back with God, so I was going to heaven and things like that. And I wanted to let him have it, but it was like, no, this is not a fight I'm worth fighting at this point. They're just not in the frame of mind to accept what I have to say, so it's time to move on. I think becoming a skeptic and becoming an atheist, it took me, and I look at my own experience, it took me the ability to sit back and really listen and get into that place where I could really listen to skeptics and atheists and hear what they had to say before I would be willing to accept it. There's an emotional acceptance or an emotional openness that you have to have, because the guards in religion are primarily emotional. Okay. You put up all these shields, okay, in front of you to protect your faith. Your faith is this core thing that you just can't get rid of. And you put all these defenses. it's when you willfully take the defenses down and you begin to realize that maybe these other people have a point, is when you start to deconvert. My problems started with my problems with the Bible. I really loved the Bible as a kid. I still like looking at it as a scholar because it's a lot of fun. I just have a very different viewpoint. But I kept my faith because of the death of my father, and I kept my faith longer because I was a minister and I had that emotion to deal with. I kept my faith longer because all these emotional reasons, okay? And once people get to the point where their emotions can shut off a little bit and they can kind of hear what you have to say, that's when it's a good time to talk to them. Like I said before, I have 5 grandchildren. The oldest one is 6, and she's starting to realize that Papa doesn't go to church anymore. And sooner or later, she's going to come and ask me why I don't go to church. Well, depending on her understanding level, that's going to be an interesting conversation. Okay. But her parents are both devout believers. And they take her to church almost every Sunday and so on and so forth. And she really believes the stories. So that becomes an interesting conversation. What do you do? Now, if it's a friend or acquaintance, it's a different story, but it's family here. I want to keep hugging my granddaughter's neck, more than I want to be right about this. Okay. So, sometimes you have to decide to pick your battles very wisely. Okay. I think that's kind of why I started the channel, because I can fight there. Okay. The people come to me to fight, and that's okay. The people come to me to discuss what's going on instead of me going out and being on another moral crusade against, the people that believe in God or whatever. My only interest now as more of a political science degree holder is when religion influences politics too much. And I try to get that out of it, but it's just, we should be making decisions on what's best for everybody, not just the religious. So, it becomes a much more interesting discussion then. But yeah, I hear you. I emotionally deal with what do I say and how I discuss it. So.
Ed, I'd like to, I'm really enjoying what you're talking about today. I really relate to it. I also am a Trinity alumni.
Okay, really?
North Central Bible College alumnus, and 25 years ordained Assemblies of God. We have a lot in common. I could talk with you probably for days and days and days. One thing that I would like to toss out is you're using the word deconversion. And years ago, 15 years ago probably, I began to see in myself not so much a deconversion as a deconstruction. And the reason for that is a lot of the things that you've actually talked about that are challenges, that I found as challenges to me, were all of these points of reference that you have that are now gone. Especially if you grew up a believer, those points of reference were put there very, very early, and now they're all removed. And all of a sudden you find yourself with nothing to pivot off of. And so like in terms of relationships, you no longer have anything in common with the massive amounts of people that you used to know. It's not there anymore. And if, like I did, once I left the church, I became a missionary. I thought, well, this is a way that I could use my skills. And but you still have this faith issue as being a missionary. And so then I went from that to an inner city mission. And you still have to use your faith in the inner city mission. And it was, by this time, it was like very far gone. And so the points of reference are there, and even politically, it's a new game. Years later, it's like I'm a liberal now. I used to be a conservative, and that point of reference is gone. So for me, it was a deconstruction, and you find yourself floundering for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really enjoying listening to you. Thank you for
Well,
this.
thank you. I think I use the term deconversion because for us, it really accurately describes what we're deconstructing from.
Yeah.
Because to me, conversion was a long discipleship type process, and it trains you to think certain ways, act certain ways, look at the world certain ways. It creates your worldview. And so deconversion is step by step tearing that apart and then reconstructing it into something else. It's not an instantaneous process. It just doesn't happen. You don't wake up one morning and, oh, I don't believe in God and everything I'm thinking right. That just doesn't work. So yeah, I use that term, and I think it resonates with a lot more people because it brings in the religious connotation. But it is about deconstructing my conversion and reversing it and getting it back to something that's a little bit more grounded in reality. Okay. To me, I want something that's real now. People ask me what I live for. I'm like, life. I just want to enjoy life, and I just want to get out from the under that thumb of feeling guilty all the time, because I have these thoughts and I have these ideas and I have, I don't like this and God says I'm supposed to like it. And, it's all of that in one big package, and you have to just kind of get out of that. And it's not, all of it just washes away someday. We don't have that. Christian salvation has that. The blood of Jesus just washes it all away and you're a completely new person and all of it changes. We don't have that. We have a much more real thing, which is it's going to take a while for me to rethink things. People ask me why I have a therapist. This is why. Because I look at the world through a very different lens, and I'm trying to come to terms with that. Because what I see through this lens is not the same as what I saw before. And okay, well, what do I think about that? How do I do that? I mean, ethics and morals become a big question once you don't have an appeal to authority. Once you've lost your appeal to authority, what do you got? You better have good doggone reasons for taking the action you're about to take. There better be a greater, feeling of good and satisfaction that you're about to have, and something that actually gets done well for people. And, I hear you, man. So yeah, but I use that term because when people hear it and they're going through it, they know exactly what I'm talking about. They pick up on it real quick. As soon as I started using it, people that are in that process of deconverting, oh, that's a great way to put it, and they immediately come and start talking to me. And that's kind of what I want. I just want conversations most of the time. Before, I was always trying to dominate the discussion to tell everybody what was right. As a Christian, this is what's right. This is what's right. This is what's right. And now it's more of, I just want to listen and find out what's right. It's been a very humbling experience. I have to admit that. It's very, I'm not going to pat myself on the back for my humility. I've still got a long way to go, but it's very humbling to have uncertainty, and be okay with it and be okay with uncertainty. That's one of the things I've had to learn, and that's a deconversion issue. Because in Christianity, everything is certain. Everything is so certain. And that's not the case anymore. Now I have to deal with ambiguity. I have to deal with shades of light and dark. I have to deal with different colors. I have to deal with things that aren't just black and white anymore. And that becomes a very interesting way to live. It's been a challenge, but I resonate with your comment. I really do. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have to say, Ed, when you said that, when you use those words about I have to be right, and everything that you said beyond that, I have used those exact same words.
Yeah.
Ambiguity, that I have to be right. This is why I didn't want to become a pastor again when I came back from the mission field. I don't want to be right anymore. The questions are more important to me now than the answers are. I'm looking for questions.
Yes, and it is a liberating feeling in some
Oh,
ways. There's a lot of freedom to that, not having to run to the Bible every time I need an answer. You know, there's a good, I can run to other sources. I can talk to other people. And so that's a big change. It is a big change. So, but yeah, I hear you.
How big is the community you live in, and have you found new friends?
Reed City is about 2,500 people. Big Rapids is south of here, about 12. It has Ferris State University. And when the college is in session, there's about 15,000 people there. The issue with like the Freethinkers group that was on campus is because it's student led, it goes up and down depending on, there's just no stability in leadership. And I'm not a student anymore. So, so that's kind of the way it works. Part of the reason I joined the Clergy Project was for community. I don't know of anybody around here that's a secularist. I have a few family members that don't believe. My two sons, for instance, are agnostics. So, and their church experiences is what pushed them to that. So the manipulation and the control and that kind of thing. So I can talk with my sons about it from time to time. Mostly they're just trying to live their life and have a good life, so they don't really want to talk to their old man as much. But
Brian's trying to get on and ask a question. He's been trying for quite some time.
Okay, sure.
I don't presume to give any kind of advice on parenting or grandparenting, but when you were talking about your inner debate about your granddaughter, the first thing that went through my mind was, well, what if she or some other member of your one of your other grandchildren turns out to be gay or trans or bi when they grow up, and what kind of if they're going to feel like they're going to have to hide it from their family, and if they reveal it, are they going to get in trouble for it? It's kind of almost like parallels the issue of being a non-believing member of the
I agree. That's an excellent question.
And just the fact that religious fundamentalism tends to teach LGBTQ plus people that they are wrong for being the way they are.
They're sinners in the hands of an angry God, to be quite blunt about it, yeah.
Seems like something that I was wondering if you thought of that. It just seems like something, maybe there's
I know that for two of my grandchildren, because they're my oldest sons, they would be very accepted. They don't have a lot of faith. He doesn't have a lot of faith left. And he's very accepting of that community. He's the head coach for Morrisville State University football team. So he's very much involved in secular university and things like that. He teaches a couple classes. So he would be very accepting if those two grandchildren came out as anything. The other ones, that would be a problem from their point of view. But from my point of view, they would probably end up gravitating toward me because I would be very accepting of them. Okay. And at that point, we can have another conversation. Okay. I would definitely have some conversations with my son-in-law and my daughter at that point about, hey, it doesn't matter what you believe, they're still your kid. And you still have to love them and you still have to accept them for who they are. Okay. And that's something 6-7 years ago I never would have said. Okay. All right. And so that's a big change for me. But that would be something important enough where I think that that's a battle that needs to have a discussion. It's something that has to be said. This is one area that I still have to process some of my unconscious biases, on it, because I was trained for so long that homosexual people are going to hell and gay people are going to hell and, people that are out of the norm are going to hell. And now I'm having to say, no, they're just human beings and they're different. And it's okay that they're different. Okay. And I like that, So, I have at work, we have somebody is trans and they're going through the transformation process. And a lot of people give them a hard time because they're Christians. I've decided to be very supportive. And I would do the same thing for my grandkids. Okay. I would do the same thing, So it's a big change for me. and this is what when I talk deconversion, this is the kind of thinking you have to get yourself out of, okay? Because you've been set, it's a pattern that's been implanted in your head. You know, it's kind of like any bias that somebody have, or even racism, like you were talking about before. Some of it you're doing, you don't even know you're doing it, okay? And it's not that you want to do it, it's just you learn something by habit or from your parents or from your family, and you just do it, and you don't even think about it. And you have to rethink those things. And the same is true for religion. Religion does that a lot. Okay, so that's kind of the way it works. Yep.
Say, how do people who think, as apparently you once did, how do they answer the question as to why would their God create people just to send them to hell? I don't, you know, that's a circle of thought that I have never been able to get. I don't understand how people can say God is responsible for everything, and then these people, what did he do? Did he make mistakes when he was creating them, or what? I don't.
That greatly depends on your theological persuasion. If you're a hardcore Calvinist, they'll tell you that he created them that way to damn them to hell for his glory, you know, however that works. If you're more Arminian, believe in free will, well, he didn't really send them to hell. They went there themselves, you know, they chose to go to hell, you know. I always ask the question, well, how would a loving God create a hell in the first place? That's my new question. You know, it doesn't seem to be, if everybody on planet Earth is God's child, okay, I can't even think of roasting one of my children in hell for all of eternity. It doesn't exist as a concept to me as a parent. Why would God have that concept? You know, it becomes a real good question. So yeah, but there's a lot of ways that people justify it. As a theologian, I used to try to justify it for years. It's one of the reasons why I stopped believing in God. You know, I just, I don't have, why would a supreme being exist if you get rid of the concept of final judgment and some of the other things? If you don't need those anymore, why do you need a supreme being anymore? You know, theologically, it just falls apart. And that's the way it was for me. It ended for me. I had tons of questions, you know, that just never got answered. And that's one of them, you know. None of those answers that I would give you are satisfactory to me. But there's tons of them. I've heard tons of different answers to that question, and none of them work. So, you know, it's like everybody thinks they work, but they don't. And that's kind of one of the things that I struggle with. Yeah.
At some point, Ed, would you consider starting a free thought group in your community?
I think so. I'm in a career transition. I'm working on a certification to go do another job. I'm not going to explain exactly what that is right now because I still have some enemies that may be watching this, or watch it in some future date, but they would try to stop me because there's a few people in my former church that are content on making me miserable as possible. So hopefully that burns out in another couple years, but I am kind of in a career transition, and once I make that transition and find my new community, yeah, I'm definitely going to think about starting something. I'm kind of at the point in my history past church where the Clergy Project kind of cautions you against that for a bit until you're a little bit more grounded in your career and things like that. So, and that's kind of what I'm focused on. So, but yeah, it's something I would do.